Hi friend, and welcome back to Marvelous Friends, your home for all things Marvel Cinematic Universe and beyond. I'm Rhett, and today I am going back and doing a 5 and 5 review over the first Iron Man film. Make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and let's roll that credit. Now, as always with my 5 and 5 reviews, how I do it is I discuss the video as a micro list of 5 favorite and 5 least favorite things in regards to the film itself. However, it's very hard, again, to go back and do some of these original films at this point while being kind of subjective to how my knowledge of the MCU was at that point and react to the film in a way that I would have out of the theater. I just want to go back and go ahead and do these videos on the films I hadn't been able to do on the channel because, of course, I didn't launch the channel until much later. So I recently did Captain America, The First Avenger. You can check it out up in the card. And today I wanted to go back and do the first Iron Man film. Now, again, there was several things in here I had to really try and be critical of only the first Iron Man film and not take into account the other 2 films or any of his other appearances throughout the MCU or any of the other character appearances that it has. So keep that in mind. I had to be a little bit nitpicky because of that, and also it's just tough because as you watch something, things that may have bothered you when you first saw it or you really liked when you first saw it change over time. So keep that all in mind, but let's go ahead and get into it with my 5 least favorite aspects of the film first. Number 5, drastic character change. Now this, like I said, is me being nitpicky, but I just feel like there is such a huge change in Tony Stark in a short amount of time in the film. Now, of course, in films and books and everything, the main protagonist goes on a journey of character development, and that's what makes them a dynamic and interesting character, is the change from where they were to where they are now. However, we see such a huge change in him from the beginning of the film till about the middle of the film, and then actually he kind of reverts back at the end. We see him go from such a carefree, playboy, genius character to suddenly caring so much that he would make himself a superhero to reverting back into this egotistical kind of self-helping, prioritizing himself person. So what I mean by this is, of course, yes, he goes through a very traumatic and extreme experience by being kidnapped and being put in that situation and nearly dying. And he learns some things that causes him to go on that path of doing something about it. However, he really doesn't try anything else. He just takes it upon himself to do it, and that he's the only one that can take care of the problem that he feels that he created or he allowed to happen. Now, I get that a little bit, but it just seems like such an extreme character change for him from where he is at the beginning to the midpoint. And then, like I said, when we see him do the press conference at the end of the film, he reverts back into his egotistical ways and his fully focusing on himself, that he declares that he is Iron Man out of almost pride in wanting that celebrity. So to kind of see him drastically change but not, I just didn't like that character development in him, and it to be so quick and then almost kind of undone. It's me being nitpicky, and I understand it's probably something a lot of people would disagree with, but I needed a number 5 for this list. Number 4, built in a cave. I'm with the scientist at StarTech on this one. I am not Tony Stark, so I can't speak to it, but I have to argue that there's probably really no way that the arc reactor at that size could have been built to the quality that it was in the cave. And here's what I mean by that. I feel like Tony Stark, yes, he has the knowledge, he is proven to be very intelligent and able to do very incredible things, both in this film, his future MCU appearances, and in the comic books. We know that he has a genius that is unmatched, really, by anyone else in the comic books, and when someone in Marvel Comics is described as a genius, they're compared to Tony Stark and how he is able to create what he does. So I don't deny that he has the ability or the know-how to figure out how to do an arc reactor to that size, but it's actually relatively pretty good quality and almost the exact same quality as the second arc reactor that he creates in his home lab. And I find that to be the stretch, because we see everything else he makes in that lab be very, or excuse me, in that cave, is very mishmashed, pieced together, not well finished. And for him to have well finished this small arc reactor that is the most advanced piece of tech that he creates in that cave comparatively to everything else, it just doesn't fly with me. Now, I get it, it's smaller parts, it's probably easier to smelt down or whatever. I'm not a blacksmith, I don't know those terms, and I'm not an engineer, so I can't really speak to all of that, so feel free to prove me down in the comments. But I again, was with the scientist. I'm not Tony Stark, so I don't believe all of that, personally. Number 3, the jump back. I understand that this is a very popular technique in film and it is used a lot, and that is probably honestly why I didn't enjoy it. The film opens with a point where we see Tony Stark's caravan ambushed and him captured and taken prisoner by the Ten Rings. And then it jumps back 36 hours and we see what leads up to it. And I really don't feel like that really was worth it. I didn't really think it added anything to the film in any way. Now, sometimes you see these jump back sequences where we start at one point in the film and then we jump back and then we see what leads up to that point. Like I said, it's a very popular storytelling technique in film and even in other forms of storytelling. But I just don't really think that this added to it in any way because it was such a short jump back, at least in the plot of the film, because we see us come back up on that point really quickly after we jump back in time. So maybe if it was more of a substantial point, maybe we see him say, "I am Iron Man," and then it jumps back to tell the story, and there's a lot more storytelling that happens before we reconnect with the beginning of the film, would have been maybe more interesting to me. But I just didn't think that this was worthwhile or added anything, because we could have just put the more expanded scenes that we see at the beginning, where they take place only 5 or so more minutes into the film as it does happen, and it would have been either, you know, you wouldn't even notice. It wouldn't have really taken away or added anything different to the story. So I think it was just kind of a waste of repetitiveness in the film, I guess you could say. Number 2, Tony is found. Now, granted, it wouldn't have been a movie if he wasn't found, but here I have issue with just how everything happens so conveniently in the film. And that is, Tony Stark is found really, really quickly in a massive desert system that is very hard to track people in. Now, granted, there was, of course, a minor explosion wherever he was, but he was catapulted and flew off and landed who knows how far away. And this whole issue with finding it easily, it happens again later on when the Ten Rings kind of organization finds all the pieces to the suit, especially considering they probably searched for a long time and how the sands shift. All that stuff probably would have been buried. Anyways, there's just a lot of timeline issues here in the desert that I really have a hard time buying into, and how he was found so easily, because yes, he caused a massive explosion which could have been signaled and tracked, but there would have been no real idea that that was linked to Tony's kidnapping. Also, we do know that he sat phoned or attempted to sat phone right before he was taken prisoner when the ambush happened, but we don't ever really see that that phone call goes through and how that would have connected to see if his location at that point. Of course, other people were there as well, such as Rhodey, but that was, of course, a different location from where he was taken. So I just had a lot of issues with the timeline of him being found, and then honestly thinking about it now as I'm saying this, also how quickly or presumed how easily the Ten Rings were able to find all the pieces to his suit. I just don't feel like that was necessary, and maybe if that whole jump back thing could not have happened, we'd have had more time in the film to maybe explore him wandering the desert a little bit longer, and that being a little bit more of a just as kind of a dire situation as him being kidnapped itself, and seeing really the struggle of him wandering the desert and trying to find shelter and water and all that, rather than him walking away from his suit and then instantly being found by his teammates, or I guess by the army. But yeah, I just had issues with timeline and kind of too easy, too fast with the whole thing here. Number 1, killing the villains. Now, this is something that happens a lot in the MCU, but this was really the first instance of it, and even back then, I remember not really liking how this was handled, and that is the immediately killing off the major villains of the film. Well, especially Obadiah, we for sure know that he is done for in that explosion and that he dies. That is all but confirmed in the scene, in the discussion with what happened to him between Pepper and Stark and Coulson. Him being Coulson saying that the black boxes on small aircraft are so unreliable, meaning that they've staged a plane crash to cover up his death and disappearance. So we know that he's dead, and it's very presumable that they also kill off Raja from the Ten Rings. I believe I'm pronouncing that correct. Correct me down in the comments if I am not. He was such a good villain, and considering the idea of him being connected to this terrorist organization known as the Ten Rings, which is of course based off the Mandarin, and of course his 10 rings, which are physical rings, but I like the idea that it created here of this network that was setting up the idea of the Mandarin, and for him to be presumably killed off. We know that all of his men get killed. We don't actually see him get killed, so he could have survived, but at this point we know that he never resurfaces, so he's pretty much a one-off villain as well. And the assumption that he was killed by Obadiah's men is pretty much something that we can say is fact. I really wish that wasn't the case. I think that he had a lot of potential, and if we're killing off one of them, I understand Obadiah. He was kind of a finite finale, big moment for his death, but for them to also just kill off the idea of the Ten Rings terrorist organization really was disappointing, because there's so much potential, especially for that one with Iron Man's story. And it set up a really bad trend of killing off villains in the Marvel movies that I think is just disappointing, because we see Marvel villains in the comic books and even just comics in general. Villains don't die off. They're not one-off for the most part. There are occasionally one-off villains that are special features, or Spider-Man has a lot of villains that just pop up and you never hear from them. But typically major villains tend to come back time and time again and pop up in other franchises and other characters' stories, and I would like to have seen that here and not have them killed off instantaneously at the end of this film. That's enough of my negatives though. Let's jump into my 5 favorite aspects of Iron Man. Number 5, Terrence Howard. Now this is of course me speaking a little bit of knowing what happens, but I really enjoyed his casting as Rhodey. I think he did a really great job of Agent James Rhodes. I really enjoyed the character and how he really was a counterpoint to Tony Stark himself. He was really kind of the rigid and serious, rule-following character, whereas Tony was a little bit more carefree, do what he wants, whatever. I liked how the two kind of were counterpoints to each other in the film. I really overall just enjoyed him. I would have really liked to have maybe seen him step into the War Machine role that he has in the comic books. We saw it definitely alluded to when he said next time when looking at the silver Iron Man suit, which really sets up a great point for Iron Man 2, but I would have maybe liked to have seen it in the first film, just because, well, it would have, again, knowing what we know post this, it would have been his only opportunity to do so, as the actor Terrence Howard was recast later on. But I really liked the role that Terrence played in this film, and of course I enjoyed Agent Rhodes, aka Rhodey, in the film as well. Number 4, Tony Stark's house. I really think that this is what launched the idea of the modern smart home. I was a fan of the Disney Channel growing up, so I remember the DCOM or Disney Channel original movie Smart House, and Tony Stark's system of Jarvis really brings that to life, having an integrated system that runs every aspect of your home. And I really think that it's what has led to the smart home of today, and that idea of everything being automated and voice controlled, because everyone wants to have a Tony Stark-esque house. That's why we have the Echo Dot or Amazon Echo, we have the Google Homes, we have all of those smart systems now for our homes, because it's just cool to be able to say a phrase, which I won't say because then all of my Google system in my home, I am a Google guy because I use Android, but all of them will go off. But it's just, that idea was, I really feel like, established in this movie of having this smart tech-driven home, and we're seeing that more and more every day with more and more technology coming out that gives us our own personal assistant, aka Jarvis, and I think it's really neat. I thought this was a really cool aspect in it. Like I said, it really kind of took me back to my childhood in the idea of the DCOM smart home, smart house, excuse me, that I really enjoyed as a kid. It's such a fun idea, and I enjoy teching out my own home now because of that. Number 3, S.H.I.E.L.D. This really set up the idea of S.H.I.E.L.D. for the MCU. I am a big fan of S.H.I.E.L.D. as far as the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. show goes that was spawned off of this, and really set up kind of the first major connection piece between all of the films, as S.H.I.E.L.D. kind of served as that as we started to develop the core group of the MCU in these first few films. I like how they introduced it. I thought it was really funny that they kept calling it the Strategic Homeland Intelligence and Intervention Logistics Division, aka S.H.I.E.L.D. It was just kind of a fun pun that was repeated over and over again, and I really enjoyed how they did it. And of course, the big reveal of Agent Fury, or excuse me, Director Fury, being introduced in the post-credit scene was really great. I just like how the whole setup went for S.H.I.E.L.D. in this film, and I like how it set up the idea of the organization for the greater MCU moving forward. Again, this is me being able to say this, having some knowledge of what has happened following this, but I enjoyed the joke and the kind of pun that they used as far as S.H.I.E.L.D. goes in this film, even from my original viewing. I just get to enjoy it even more so now. Number 2, current event relevance. Now, Marvel has the great advantage over DC, in my opinion, because Marvel Comics takes place in our world. The predominant cities are cities that we know, not fictionally made up ones like Metropolis or Edge City or, Gotham. Instead, we see the characters taking place in our actual world. And I like that we saw that here in the MCU as well in this first adaptation of Iron Man, and that it really played into current events really well. At this time, the war on terror in the Middle East was a major threat, and a lot of people were still really scared about the idea of terrorist organizations and stuff like that that were out there and were a threat to our way of life here in the United States. And for them to play into that and really kind of set up those ideas to make it relevant to the world at that time was really smart, and creating this Ten Rings terrorist organization that takes inspiration from Iron Man comic books and adapts it into the world that we lived in made it that much more interesting, and we really could see kind of the world of today reflected in the film. And I think they also did a good job, for the most part, of scaling the technology to fit within the world. Yes, Iron Man is very tech-heavy in its comic books, and Tony Stark is a tech genius. And they could have really went way out there with the technology that we see him using. In some aspects of it are very science fiction, and even today don't really exist. Especially kind of some of the projecting and scanning technology that he uses as far as Jarvis in his lab goes. But we do see technology advancing and catching up to that point, and it's becoming less science fiction. So I like that they did scale some aspects of it to be very realistic, while still kind of keeping it at this idea that he is more advanced than us. So these ideas of really placing the film in context of the modern age and what was happening in the world really was cool. I really enjoyed that, and it really made for kind of a better experience because, again, it made the film feel like it was taking place in our world, which is the fun part about Marvel Comics, is it allows you to escape the everyday realism of our world, but kind of still relate to it because it takes place in a alternate version of our reality, which is really cool and something I really love about Marvel Comics, so to see it in the film was perfect. Number 1, Robert Downey Jr. I don't think they could have cast anyone better for this film to play Tony Stark. If you don't remember, at the time, Robert Downey Jr. was really at a low point in his career. He hadn't been in much. He was in and out of rehab. I believe he had been jailed for his kind of party boy, playboy ways that he had. He had some drug problems. He was, I believe, don't quote me on that. I don't want to say that he had drug problems and he didn't, but he was kind of known for being a playboy and kind of had dove too much from his early stardom and kind of taken a back seat. And so Marvel Studios really took a risk in casting him for this, but because of his own personal life experiences, he really was able to jump into this idea of someone who comes from that life and is looking to reform in the way that Tony Stark does. Not only that, but he looks so much like Tony Stark from the comic books, just naturally, and then when you give him those little sculpting pieces like the facial hair that is so distinguishedly unique to the comic book character of Tony Stark, it just really seals it. I don't think anyone else could have played him. Even today, I think they would really have a hard time finding someone who doesn't embody him as well as Robert Downey Jr. does. And it was really the first moment where we saw Marvel Studios has a way of finding actors and casting people into the roles from the comic books in such a way that really reflects who they are in the comic books. And impressed, super loved the casting. And like I said, to this day, I don't know if anyone else could have played Tony Stark, Iron Man, any better than Robert Downey Jr. has. And it has been such an enjoyment to have him as the character, and it's so sad to see him kind of bowing out from the character, but hopefully we still get to see him make cameo appearances in the future. We do know that he's popping up in the Black Widow film, so he may be dead in the current day of the MCU, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he is completely out of the MCU. So I hope we get more of him. I love the casting. I loved the film as a whole. Like I said, especially with the negatives, having seen this film so many times, I really enjoyed it. I mean, without this film, we really wouldn't have had the MCU, so it's hard not to like it. And at the time, it was such a big change from other hero films and stuff like that we've seen, because it really started setting up these ideas of interconnectivity and there being a bigger world out there, that it was so different from what we had seen already in superhero genre films, and I really enjoyed it. It was so, even I think if I were to do this video back when it first came out, I would have had a hard time critiquing it negatively, because it was just so cool, and really and truly, even like the computer effects and stuff like that, considering they could have went so far with CGI and gone really weird and trying to make it the tech super sci-fi, everything looked really clean, and yeah, just super impressed with it. Again, love this film. Would love to know what you guys think of the original Iron Man film. What are your favorite parts and least favorite parts of the film? Let me know down in the comments. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel and set alerts to get alerted for all my future videos. It helps the channel so much when you guys do that, and I greatly appreciate it. Until my next video, guys, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Excuse me, a marvelous rest of your day. Bye, friend.